it's kind of like the rug is pulled out from underneath a person, and it makes people very vulnerable to mental health concerns, unhealthy coping behaviors, etc. So I think, well, and I also wanted to state, I feel like this is relevant for you all too as coaches, who inevitably, this is a change in your rhythm and routine and life of not being able to meet with your athletes regularly. I know I've been watching my husband go through this spring season of not being able to meet with his kids, and how will he stay kind of connected to his athletes and have a meaningful relationship without being able to meet and train in person. So I'm hopeful too that this activity could be useful for you as well, of thinking about and paying more attention to your own identity and what is changing and shifting right now. So I'm going to do a little bit of education and then introduce this activity. So just to start with defining identity, like the technical definition of identity is the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. So essentially it's how you see yourself or how others see you. And I like to think of the statement of how would you fill in the blank of I am, or I am a, right? Like what would you claim about yourself? And I think it's important to name that there's parts of our identity that are chosen and not chosen. And certainly privilege, I don't want to this could be a whole nother talk, but privilege could also play a role in our identities, of things that, places of identity where we hold privilege, or places of identity where we don't hold privilege, and therefore that impacting our other identities or how we make choices about our identities. So I'm aware of that, and that's not where we're gonna go in this mini lesson, but it is something to consider when bringing this to your athletes. So I think the charge or the excitement about this is there is a lot of value in having people do more intentional work on their identity, because I would say by default, if you're not paying attention to that, typically our identity becomes what we do. So for example, this might be a little bit more of an extreme example, but when we did a workshop for some Pacific Northwest ballet dancers, and we were covering some things around mental health, and we talked about identity. And when we brought in this question of having some attention to how they identified, there was a very big challenge of thinking about anything else that they could identify besides being dancers. So oftentimes, again, it's because at that level of dancing, that's what they're doing most of their day. And so there was a big curiosity and kind of a blankness about who they were outside of that particular identity. And so, as you can imagine, what can be challenging about having a one-dimensional identity is that if that identity is threatened or taken away, then you're left in a very vulnerable position. So what our hope is, what we're trying to do at Opal in some of this work, is to give people the space to explore this, to have more awareness around how they identify, and help them build identity to make it more robust. I'm going to be a little cheesy and give you a demonstration that I do in my talks with athletes. And this is a card demonstration, but imagine that you have one aspect of your identity. So if I say I'm a runner, and that's kind of all that I identify with, and right, I can easily rip that card. Which happened to me, I got injured my senior year with a stress fracture, and my running career in college was over. And that was a very dark season for me, because my identity was so wrapped up in that, in being a runner, and now this was gone, right? So it's very flimsy. Now, as you can imagine, if you have more aspects of identity, so I'm a runner, I'm actually a basketball player, a wife, a mother, a risk taker, I'm honest, what else? I like reading, I'm an introvert. So these are all aspects of my identity, and I cannot no longer, as much as I tried really hard, I have the athletes try really hard, you cannot rip this stack of cards. And say again, if I get injured and my running identity is removed from my existence for a period of time, I still have this stack of cards that I am not able to rip, right? So this idea being that the more that we can help our athletes strengthen their identities, the more resilient our athletes will become, the stronger they will have a stronger sense of who they are, and it won't be their sense of themselves won't be tied to a particular identity. So the other piece I want to kind of expand on is even within a component. So say my running identity, I guess using this card demonstration, how can we help make that identity more expansive? So how could we thicken this card, to use the card example? Because there's ways I think our identities can be more flimsy and thicker and more robust. I see this a lot with our clients of even when you ask them the question, well, what does being a runner mean? What goes into that identity? How would you define it? And what I've noticed is oftentimes people come up with a very narrow definition of what that identity is. So for example, with a runner, it might be, well, I can only call myself a runner if I've had particular achievements, or if I'm running for varsity, or if I am racing consistently throughout the year. That's the only way I can define myself as a runner. So it could be very flimsy, and if those things aren't happening, then I can't call myself a runner anymore. A more expansive identity that we try to help build, or at least create an imagination for our clients is, for example, a runner identity might not be dependent on achievement. We could even think about pleasure being the main source of the identity. So I'm a runner because I love to run. I love that activity. I love that movement. It could be taken into account that changes of that expression are welcomed. So for example, the rhythms of life, of aging and seasons where maybe you're working more hours and not being able to run as much, and maybe there's months that you haven't run, but then you come back to it in the summer, or that all can be encompassed in a runner identity. It has a more long-term perspective. You might also include in that traits that are very a part of being a runner, and characteristics, right? So like hardworking or coachable or passionate can fit into that kind of running identity in a way that again thickens that and makes it more robust. And I would say like that, again, that makes it a lot less flimsy and contingent on circumstances, which again builds resilience in terms of claiming and holding an identity. So these are all, I think that, I guess before we go into this activity, I think I just want to state, I mean, the main point here is that this strong identity really matters in building resiliency. And you as a coach have a lot of power and influence to help build your athletes' identities. And I want to help, I think maybe we can use some of the question and answer time to talk more about that, but I want to offer at least this one exercise that you can be bringing. And I'm imagining in this exercise, this could be something that you build into even a coaching practice that's rhythmic. So maybe this is in a preseason team meeting, or some kind of meeting where you're talking about team skills or team support. And it can be something that you regularly bring in, because then you're also demonstrating in that you care about their identity development, and that you are interested in knowing who they are and how they identify themselves. Because one also, now I'm going to jump back a second. It's really important to understand kind of this internal and external identity of how does the athlete see themselves, because oftentimes I think we're operating with how we see somebody else, and we might say, well, gosh, that person, well, they are a runner and they are kind and they are all these traits, but that might not be how the athlete sees themselves and has that internal sense of who they are. And so by doing an exercise like this, you also are able to get a window into their internal world and how they view themselves, which you could be shocked by. And yet it gives you really helpful information for how to kind of show up for your athlete when you have a better sense of, gosh, well, do they have quite a, is it a one-dimensional identity, and it might give you good information for understanding their behavior as an athlete. So I think I'm going to stop there, because I know I could talk I could talk a lot about this, but I'd love to talk about it more in a question and answer format. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to try this yourself, this activity. So we call it the identity pie chart. It's kind of a simple activity, but it really is transferable for different age athletes. You can make it more complex if you're working with older athletes, or you can make it more simple with younger athletes. But I want to have you take some time to work on your own identity pie chart. And now I'm not the best tech person, so I'm going to put up a, can you just do it? I have someone here helping me. Oh, here we go. Look at that.
Oh, wait.
Uh-oh.
We didn't share the screen.
We're going to screen share this. There we go. And, oh, that's the first one. Okay, so can you all see this? So this is, I mean, again, simplistic, but really thinking of it as a pie chart where you are labeling parts of your identity. And here are some examples. This is actually a colleague of mine did this for a presentation she was giving around her skating identity. So these are the ways she built out kind of categories. I also literally just took pictures of a couple clients' pie charts that are part of my Rethinking Exercise and Sport group. So on this slide, you see one of the clients we do these variants of the pie charts, and I'll share some of that with you to take to your athletes if you want to, but this one on the right is a current pie chart and a past pie chart. So seeing the shift of identity in a past and current model. And then this one on the left, I think is just I don't think it was a variant. It was just how she was currently seeing herself and her identity. So I'm going to give you some categories if it feels tricky maybe to think about what you put in your identity pie chart, and we're going to take about five minutes. Does that sound?
Yep.
Good?
I'll set a timer.
Okay.
Okay, just another minute, minute and a half or so.
But then when I do the screen share, I'll do that next slide until then.
All right, I think we're probably good.
Okay. I wanted to put one more slide before I take the screen share off.
Yeah.
And maybe for a screenshot, like I don't know if we can give these slides to the participants, but I wanted to include, in case you use this activity with your athletes, that here are different variations that you can do of the pie chart work. So like I said earlier, you could do two charts, one with, you know, how others identify you, how you define yourself, and kind of have a compare and reflection over how those compare. We also do a being versus doing. So being meaning your internal characteristics of how you see yourself and your doing, so your roles or how you spend your time. And then we've done one with past and present and future or aspirational. And then you can also do like what Chrissy had done on her skating one, of expanding a particular identity to do a pie chart for all the variation within a particular identity. So these are all ways to just, again, grow some awareness and utilize the learning that can come from this. One thing I actually forgot to mention that I think is important is that on the being versus doing, I think it's really important when you're developing someone's identity to have some traits take up some of that space, because they're more they have more solid, they can provide a more solid foundation because they're not contingent again on doing, right? So if something changes or circumstances change in your life, there is something about being able to hold on to parts of identity that can remain as, you know, more remains the same throughout life circumstances. So I think you guys are going to attach the reflection. Is it true that you guys are going to attach those reflection questions that I gave?
Yeah, the questions that were
The ones in the email, we'll put them on our website when we post this
Yeah.
to our website. When we get it downloaded, we'll attach that reflection piece as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want me to put those in the chat now, or do you want me to do that later?
I don't think you need to put it in now. But I compiled a reflection question sheet that you can have to bring in with this exercise of what then can your athletes think about as they are processing their experience of doing this activity.
Great.
Okay, so now I'll stop the share.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then if you want to say anything to kind of sum up, but then we can also, just as a reminder, people have questions to put them in the chat. It's kind of the easiest way to manage it, I think. And then we'll call on people.
Yeah, so if there's questions about using that activity or how you would do that activity, that's great. Or if you want to just talk more about identity work in general, I feel open to whatever there's more energy around, or what would be most helpful.
Okay. Well, I know we had am I on mute? No. We had a few questions. Oh, we've got some. Here we go. So I've got a question. I've got a couple others that had come in earlier, but from Melissa, how do you debrief this activity? Would you recommend in a team setting that coaches debrief with individual athletes to keep things confidential? So individual versus group, how would you?
That's a great question. So that is that reflection questionnaire that that you will be getting, and I can just kind of say a few things that are on there. So It would be helping to identify, where do you feel emotion in this exercise or energy? What parts of your identity do you want to grow? What parts of your identity do you want to lessen? What actions or behaviors can you take this week to grow your identity, to grow an identity, to lessen an identity? And then I added questions like, what is something you want to share about your identity work with someone close to you, a teammate, a coach, parents, or friends? And how can your coach support your identity development? So I think in terms of implementation of an activity like this, I think, I guess it kind of depends on your team culture. I don't know if I would make a blanket recommendation for how you would do it. I'm imagining you can do it in a group setting with your athletes of doing that activity, but in terms of sharing that, I would definitely make that obviously, not mandatory, that if they wanted to share aloud with their teammates to help them learn about each other and know about each other better. And certainly I think there is value for coach to be a part of that. But I guess I would say it probably depends on the, I think probably depends on the setting or your particular coaching culture, how much you would be participating in that. I think your interest in understanding the athlete's identity would go a long ways for your athlete to want to be known by coach. So.
Great. And then have you run this activity virtually yet? And if you did you change anything about how you did it? Given our current conditions, have you done it?
I have not, because our higher level of care program is still in person. So we've been doing, where I bring this activity in is in group settings at Opal with our clients, and I brought it into presentations, but I haven't done a virtual. This is my first virtual presentation.
Oh, well, there you go. Good job. No, you're doing awesome.
Yeah.
Another question from Ellie, how do you facilitate honesty in this exercise? How do weaknesses fit into this?
Yes, I'm so glad that was something I wanted to mention, because there's going to be parts of identity that can be kind of, harmful parts of our identity, right? For example, with our clients, a big part of their identity pie chart might be their eating disorder, of a place, or identifying with something that is, that they would want to lessen, right? So it kind of can go both ways. Healthy parts of identity or places in identity that have caused a lot of pain or suffering. And so it could be quite vulnerable to express that within the pie chart. Now I'm forgetting what the original question was.
Just how do you facilitate honesty in this exercise? How do weaknesses fit in?
Okay. Yeah. So I think again, my understanding through group work is honesty. I think the modeling of that we're imperfect people, right? Like the modeling how we're showing up to our own leadership around activities like this, I think helps promote more honesty in an activity. So maybe it is even, I don't know if the vulnerability of even whoever's sharing this activity, if that is coach, to be able to say, well, this is my pie chart. This is how I identify with myself, and you also can be modeling that it can feel complicated, and that there can be parts of identity that aren't necessarily positive, and so that can promote the leadership of promoting honesty. And then I also think there's ways of making it a little safer with like even how are we sharing ourselves, in a large group setting versus a small group setting, and maybe there is the ability to break off with buddies. I know virtually maybe the chat room features.
Yeah, yeah. The breakout rooms are a good option on Zoom if you have it.
Yeah. So I think like we just did a pretty vulnerable staff meeting on Zoom, and we used the breakout feature for the staff members that were on the virtual meeting, and then those who was in person broke off into pairs. But I think that is one way to promote more honesty, is having the small group, the two, the one-on-one share. And then when you bring it to the larger group setting, then whoever's comfortable sharing can, but the people that would be more comfortable one-on-one have that opportunity.
Okay, great. Next question is from Charlotte Richardson. Do you see a difference in working with boys and girls? Do you talk about it differently?
Great question. I don't think I'm going to be, I have not worked with yes, my experiences with female athletes. Although I would say that I did talk with my husband about this, who coaches all boys at O'Day High School. And he, like the feedback, I think he would use this activity with his athletes.
Okay.
So he didn't feel like it was prohibitive from a gender standpoint.
Okay. Yeah, just as a side note, I shared this with Kara when we were prepping for this exercise, but I have a 11-year-old son, and I thought this was really, he's really into sports. His whole life is hockey, ice hockey, basketball, baseball. And when I saw this topic, I thought, this would be great for him. I think he would love this activity. And as a side note, I was sharing with Marie earlier that I think it's boys, girls, any sport really. So I shared this with the athletic director at Central Catholic, because I thought, any coach can really benefit from this. I mean, we're focusing on the subset for the bulk of our material, but really you can apply this across sport and gender, I feel.
Right.
So
well, I brought this activity. I did a 4th grade workshop for it was kind of a puberty, mental health workshop, and this was one of the activities. And so I did the workshop when both of my girls were in 4th grade, and I learned a lot about them as a mom, seeing how they were, again, self-identifying, right? Like, what were they putting on their chart, and how what were they claiming as parts of their identity? And again, for as much as we might think we know somebody, there's a lot to be said about how people really identify themselves, and it's valuable information.
It is. Next question is from Amber. Hi, Kara. Are reflective exercises the primary method you recommend to coaches in building identity? What other methods or opportunities do you use as a coach to facilitate identity building outside of reflection?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I definitely think there's other ways as a coach to help build identity in athletes. I think, something like this, it's a little bit more formal of an intentional exercise is one way. I think simply the value of a coach being interested in their athlete's life and asking questions and showing engagement and interest in other parts of who they are and hobbies and interests. And I mean, that in of itself is a piece of valuing identity outside of who they are as an athlete. I was thinking of this question earlier. The other piece is, I think that I feel really strongly about that whole internal characteristic side of identity development. And so coaches finding the opportunity to reflect character traits that they see in their athletes and affirm and name those things. Because again, without having kind of direct feedback from a coach, you can make a lot of assumptions about what they value about you, right? Like, I know in my history in athletics, I made a lot of assumptions about what made my coach proud or what made my coach happy, that probably a lot of it wasn't even true. So for coaches to, again, have some intention about affirming other parts of their athlete and thinking of that piece around both things that they do and celebrating accomplishments, but also what are some of these internal characteristics that you see in your kids, in your athletes. I also was thinking of like a way of this, it wouldn't be directly from the coach, but it could be a system that you set up of creating some sort of buddy system within your teams, because I know a lot of these cross country and track teams are really big. And so how do you also help maybe facilitate more small group relationships where the athletes can get to know each other better and have more connection together? So maybe they could build a routine of having a weekly time that 2 or 3 buddies get together, and it's about connection and something kind of non-running related. Maybe it's a coffee date, I don't know, depending on the age, or a time, again, maybe there's a rhythm there where athletes can get to know themselves outside of that identity as a runner. Because we're human beings that want to connect and be known.
Okay, next question. What are the signs of athletes who may have a narrow identity? So if a coach, I mean, some coaches online might just take this and do it blanket with all their athletes, but what are signs for them to like say, hey, maybe I need to, I haven't done it yet, but maybe I should do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about this too, of like, how would you kind of be alerted to maybe an athlete who this could be a struggle? And I was thinking a lot about me because of my own experience of having my identity really narrow and flimsy. I think this is all, there's probably a multitude of signs, but one sign could be taking results too seriously in competition I remember crying, after so many races of just being so distraught from a poor performance or a poor race. Again, because it was so deeply embedded in my identity that that it made me feel bad about myself, right? Like that I wasn't worthwhile if I wasn't going to perform well. So paying attention to how kind of athletes respond to results and competition, I think that also kind of ties into flagging some perfectionism in an athlete. That could be tied to perfectionism, could be really tied to identity. I also was thinking of preoccupation with too much energy and behavior invested in one thing in their life, and maybe being really preoccupied by one part of their life, like running, or maybe being a student. Like that's how actually I've noticed with my daughter is she's so rigid with this online schooling thing, because I think it's an identity she's really trying to preserve in herself. And so she's not being asked to do 6 hours of work a day, but she is dogged about doing it. And I think it's a coping thing around preserving this identity that is really strong in her, that's been revealed through this pandemic. And so that is like a sign for me of just wondering about that. And then I was also thinking about this kind of idea of really holding on strongly to something and not feeling choice. Could also be like a manifestation of having a pretty narrow identity, where you kind of have to hold on it for dear life. Like if it's gone, I don't know who I'm going to be. And I mean, we've even had clients say, I feel like I'm going to die, right? Like I feel like I don't know how to even be with myself if I'm not holding on so tightly to this identity. And so a sign of that could be, it might be difficult for somebody to be resting or not producing. Being uncomfortable with oneself, with free time, without structure, could be signs.
Thank you. And then we'll probably wrap up in a couple of minutes, just to keep to the mini Zoom, although there are lots of great questions. So I'm just gonna, if you have anything that comes after, you can funnel them to Maria and I, or we can point you to Kara. We can talk about that later, but we'll have this available after the session. Next question we have is, how would you speak to flexibility and identity, because it can change? Is this addressed by having many identities, or do you also address attachment to identities?
Great. I think that's a great question. I think it's both. I think that there is more flexibility the more you have in that pie chart, because again, we're not so tied to our worth being so lodged into one. And so that helps with flexibility and adding things to the pie. Like one of the things you can even have in your identity pie chart is things that you like, or things that you think you might like. And so to have some fluidity of having more things kind of being brought into your identity, things that you decide you want to discard or lessen. And so I think that those, it does require flexibility and having some openness. And again, to that point about attachment, not being so tightly clinging onto something, but having have more even interest in kind of the unknown. I think a lot of our clients are very afraid of the unknown and are incredibly, they see the unknown as more of a threat than an opportunity for something more or change or something positive. They see it usually as like a negative threat. And so again, your your modeling, your the way that you can encourage or invite your athletes into that. You can talk about your own experience with it. Like, gosh, I was scared about this, but then, you know, I noticed when I really let myself move towards something I wanted, blah, 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 right? Like, you can give your own stories around your own experiences with identity shifting. And I think that can go a long way too. Because again, you're modeling some of that flexibility or that, the possibilities.
Great.
Awesome. You're muted, Robin.
Getting confused on whether I muted or unmuted her. Addie had asked, we will go ahead and post the reflection questions to our website. So we're gonna do this one last question and then we'll wrap it up. We got one, yeah. Do you ever see situations where the athlete has deeper issues such as depression or OCD? And if so, how do you deal with them? That's a big one, but.
Yeah, in terms of how this relates to identity.
Yeah. As you're going through that exercise, I guess, or going through that kids that have identity issues, do they typically, or do you see that they have deeper issues?
Well, I think it can come, I think some of that, it's like the chicken or the egg, right? So I think one thing, like I said before, if you have a very narrow identity and it's in your kind of doing, so like the experience that I had of having my identity so wrapped up in my performance, then when those things change, then that can be a place of susceptibility to mental health issues, like depression. Oftentimes, what really is happening in that too, like there's so much, there's grief, and if there isn't kind of a way of somebody being supportive of working through grief, when these things change as they inevitably do, then that can turn into a more turn into something that's more like depression or anxiety. And again, maybe some susceptibility to disordered behavior. I know a lot of folks, a lot of athletes end up turning towards eating, some obsession with eating and fixation and compulsion with eating and exercise, partially because there wasn't kind of either some of that preventative work going into a big change or support around that change when their experience with athletics was either taken with retirement or injury, or yeah, just again some sort of external shift.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'm going to, Marie's going to.
Yeah, I'll take it over.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kara. One thing that we believe in so much is that as coaches, we're here not just for them as runners, but as people and as humans. And I think it's our job to take care of them and guide them and nurture them. And so I think this is right along those lines. So thank you so much. Next week, same time, same place, possibly, depending where you're at. We're going to have our next Wildwood Wednesday with Eric Detman. He's the head coach at Lincoln, where I coach. A couple little facts about him. If you see the long green line, he's twin too. He's also the only person to be a runner and a coach at NXN, but we're having him on because as a male coach, he builds fabulous relationships with females. He's very intentional with his purpose, his practice. He's a great relationship builder, and we're excited for him to kind of share how he goes about things. He's super intentional. So we hope to see you guys next week. We'll keep putting information out on our website, our newsletter, and Instagram and stuff. So
yeah,
if you have any questions, stay on. Otherwise, we hope to see you guys next week.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kara.
Yeah. You're welcome. You want me to stay on?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we usually hang out for a few minutes.
No.
Elizabeth.